Name 3 problems you think a migrant worker faces every day.
Housing, health insurance, and job security.
How many migrant workers do you think earn below the minimum wage?
Like 9 out of 10.
What do you think a migrant worker is?
I think it's somebody who has to travel a pretty good distance to work.
The book Barefoot Heart by Elva Trevino Hart is an autobiography about her and her family's life as Mexican migrant farm workers. The story takes place in Texas and in Minnesota during the 1950s. Her parents were Mexican immigrants fighting to make a living in America. Every summer, her and her family went to Minnesota and Wisconsin to work at the farms. During the summer, her family worked extremely hard because the job was paid based upon how much work was done. They lived in horrible conditions that were not fit for people to live in. Her family did not show much emotions to each other. Elva felt left out from her family. She was the youngest by 7 years and her mother did not have much time for her. In the words of Elva, this family never talked. Hard work, sadness, and silence. Her father was the dictator of the household to the point that his children resented him for it. Her mother worked the hardest of them all, taking care of 6 children and working in the fields. The amount of work drove her to nervous breakdowns. Elva's father always said, "Work hard, do your homework, finish high school, and then you'll be set. You'll never have to work as hard as I did, or for as little money." Finishing high school was the most important thing to him. Elva fell in love with learning and books, which drove her to want to attend college. Her father saved up enough money to put her through, and she was the only one out of all of her siblings to graduate college. All the hardships she endured made her a stronger person. In the end of the story, she gets married, has a child, and becomes an extremely successful woman. She surpassed all adversity and turned her life around.
A connection from Barefoot Heart and Cry the Beloved Country is the racial prejudice that the main characters experience. In Cry the Beloved Country, Stephen Khumalo sees the racial injustice in the city of Johannesburg. An example is when in Chapter 1 we see the difference of lands that the white people have versus what the black people have. It talks about hills having grass that is rich and matted. You cannot see the soil. But when you go down to the valley, it is red and barren. They cannot hold rain and mist. The first quote describes the lush land that the white people live in, and the second describes the barren land that the black people live in. Another example of racial injustice in the book is Chapter 3 when Stephen Khumalo boards the train to go to Johannesburg. He climbed into the carriage for non-Europeans already full of the humbler people of his race. In this quote, it shows how the buses were segregated. An example of segregation in Barefoot Heart is on page 174 where Elva is describing the town. She says, "In Parishall, even the cemeteries were segregated. There might have been 1 or 2 Mexicans buried in the Gringo cemetery, but the Mexican cemetery was pure. No Gringo in Parishall would allow his body to rot for eternity among the Mexicans." And then again she says, "No one told us to, but we segregated ourselves in the schoolyard." Both books show extreme racial segregation. In Cry the Beloved Country, the segregation is between blacks and whites, and in The Barefoot Heart, the segregation is between Hispanics and white people. Both books show extreme segregation throughout and how it affects them and their lives. Another connection between the 2 books is the poverty experienced in both Cry the Beloved Country and Barefoot Heart. In Chapter 1 of Barefoot Heart, Elva describes the house that she is forced to live in at the migrant camps. She describes it as a stop sign-shaped house with 1 door and windows all around. The house only had 1 room with a bed, a stove, and a kitchen table. This is just one depiction of the conditions that millions of migrant families had to live in. Some children were able to grow up and escape the poverty, but many were not. The most that these migrant workers can make is a little lower than minimum wage, which is impossible to sustain a family with. In Cry the Beloved Country, there were so many poor black people in Johannesburg that many of them must move to a temporary town called Shantytown. This book describes the town as a great village of sack and plank and iron with no rent to pay, only a shilling to the committee. The village was not built to help people to escape poverty. It is only a place that consolidates and sustains poverty. This forces many black people to become criminals, which only makes the injustice increase. Lastly, a connection between the 2 stories is between the characters Elva from Barefoot Heart and Stephen Khumalo from Cry the Beloved Country. Both Elva and Stephen Khumalo overcame the adversity that the world threw at them. Elva overcame poverty and racial prejudice to become a college graduate with 2 different degrees. Stephen Khumalo took all the bad things that were happening to him, like his son committing murder, his son having a baby with a woman out of wedlock, his sister being a prostitute and into drugs and crime, and his brother being a corrupt politician, and turned them into a good thing. He improved his community with all the knowledge that he gained from the journey and became a better person throughout the badness of his life.